House hacking. I have to admit, I kind of like the term. It's a lot better than a lot of the other acronyms and terms people have come up with for different investment strategies. House hacking means that you buy a multifamily property and you move into one of the units and you have renters in the other unit. The whole idea being that if all worked really perfectly, you'd get to live for free because the income from the other renters would cover your mortgage, all the while you're reaping all the benefits of having an investment property. Desirably, you live for free, or at least hugely discounted or cheaper than you would if you were not doing this. Another way to house hack is if you live in, you buy a single family house of some sort and you rent out the bedrooms or the different rooms to different tenants. You know, whatever the idea is, you're living somewhere where you also have tenants, and hopefully they're paying enough to either cover your mortgage or greatly discount it. Cool concept, and it can absolutely work. And I love the term house hacking. However, I just, as an aside, I do think it can work fantastic, but there are things you need to think about before you dive into just any random property where you're going to house hack. And I feel like people skip over these considerations and they just assume that if they're going to house hack, it's going to be profitable and it's going to make sense. Yes, in some cases it is, but in a lot of cases it's not. And people just dive right in, kind of having no idea what they're doing. So, as I've said in other videos, always know where your profit's going to come from. And this very much includes house hacking. So, I think that there are a few things that everyone should consider before they dive into that house hack, just to make sure that you know exactly what you're doing and that there is some room for potential profit here. So, again, it's kind of become a trendy term, and I feel like that is encouraging people to just dive in. So, what are the things to think about? I can give you a hint. A lot of them have to do with the numbers. Shocker in real estate investing, I know. So, the number one consideration, which does have to do with the numbers, is the price that you're going to pay for that property versus the income you're going to receive. So in general terms, this could be called the price to rent rate. It's related to the price to rent ratio. So if we're talking about a single family house, straight investment property, forget house hacking for a second. The price to rent ratio is how much you have to pay for that house versus what you're going to get in income. And what that's going to tell you is the income going to be high enough to cover your cost associated with buying that house? Because if the income is not, you're going to be in a negative cash flow situation. Like, you don't want to buy a rental property where the income's not high enough to cover all of your costs, because then you're just not profiting. So it's a big deal. And if you're like me, growing up just assuming every rental property is profitable, or anyone who owns a rental property is financially savvy, that's not the case. So the price to rent ratio, that's how it goes on single family houses. So it's related to this idea of how much are you going to pay for this house versus how much are you going to get in rent. Think about it. There's going to be a huge difference. If you buy a fourplex near me in Los Angeles, you are going to pay a ton of money as compared to, say, a fourplex in, I don't know, the Midwest somewhere, Kansas City, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, wherever. Um, but what's more important than how much you're going to pay? It'd be one thing in Los Angeles if, let's say, you have to pay $1 million for a fourplex in a iffy area, which is what you're going to get. It'd be one thing if the rent that you could charge for each of those other 3 units or 4 units, whatever you're going to do, was high enough to cover that cost. Then this would be a very different discussion. That's the price to rent ratio. However, if you've been exploring investing at all, you'll know that price to rent ratios are not consistent across the US. On the West Coast in general, and kind of the whole western side of the United States, rents typically don't cover the cost that it would require to buy a property, single family, multifamily, whatever. You can't charge enough in rent to cover that cost, because unlike commercial investments, you can't dictate how much you charge in rent. It has to be market value. Otherwise, you're just not going to get tenants. The market dictates how much rent you can charge. You don't have that option like you would with commercial. So in Los Angeles, let's say that I buy a fourplex for $1 million, just to keep the numbers savvy. I live in one unit, so I can rent out 3 of the other units. I mean, we're talking for $1 million in Los Angeles in a so-so area, chances are those 3 units are 1 bedrooms. Maybe there's a small 2 bedroom in there. Well, in that particular area, how much could I charge per room? Well, I don't know, or per unit, I mean. I don't know. Chances are I can't charge enough to cover the mortgage. There's very little chance of that happening. So that's what you need to be aware of. So you're thinking about the price versus the income you can bring in. In the Midwest, you might easily be able to charge enough to cover your mortgage because the mortgage probably isn't going to be it's not going to be nearly as high as in Los Angeles. So think about what you have to pay. And this goes for any investment property, all rental properties, but in a house hacking situation, don't skip over this step. How much are you paying versus how much you can feasibly get in income? And run the numbers just like you would a straight investment property. Make sure that you know, are you expecting to be profitable every month? Like, is this a positive cash flow situation? Are you potentially going to break even? There'd be plenty of arguments saying that breaking even in this case would be great, because if you break even, your mortgage is covered, you're kind of living for free, which is great. And you have the other profit centers of owning a property. If you're negative, if the rent from those 3 units is not going to cover your mortgage, by how much? Can you afford to cover that every month? And is that number, how does that compare to if you were to just rent your own apartment somewhere? So make sure you understand the numbers, because this goes back to the whole idea of make sure you know where your profit is expected to come from on a property. Another consideration about house hacking, location. Do you do you want to live there? Like, you're probably going to have to buy a property in a particular location in order to get the right price point in order for this concept to work. I live in Venice Beach, out in Los Angeles, West Side, Venice Beach. Despite everyone here looking homeless, it's extremely expensive to live here. So if I buy a property here and I'm going to house hack it, whether it's a duplex, triplex, fourplex, whatever, I don't want roommates, so I'm not going to do rooms. I'm going to be so far in the hole because of what it cost me to buy that property, that it would be cheaper for me to rent somewhere on my own. So in order for those numbers to work, I would have to move inland. I would have to move closer into LA, somewhere, not even downtown, but somewhere on the outskirts of downtown. I don't want to live there. Like, I want to live in Venice Beach. So at that point, what are my options? Either I go live somewhere that I don't really want to live just to almost get the numbers to work, or I just live where I want to. And I either lose a ton trying to house hack, or I don't house hack at all and I just keep renting where I live because it's a gazillion dollars cheaper than the loss I would take on from the house hack. Is everyone following? Because even in my head, this is getting like, I could go so many different directions with this. So the non-numbers consideration of this is location. Do you want to live in the place where the numbers work? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Like, life is short. I vote don't live somewhere you don't want to live. That leads me into another consideration. Let's say that you want to do it short term, kind of temporarily. Like, oh, well, I don't have to live in my perfect dream location for, I could skip doing that for 5 years. Maybe I go buy, the property where the numbers work, and I just kind of do it for 5 years and then I move on. Then I fill my unit with another tenant and then I'm profitable. Well, maybe run those numbers. But what is your long-term plan? This is another consideration for house hacking, because if you're going to do it really short term, don't forget, in that mortgage time, for the first 5 to 7 years, you're going to be paying primarily interest, not principal. So if your plan is to do this and leave after 5 years and sell the property, you really want to make sure you run those numbers, because you're not even going to really have a whole lot of principal pay down at that point. So are you banking on appreciation? Are you getting cash flow? Where is your profit coming from if you're planning to leave in 5 years? If you're planning in 5 years to convert it to a solid rental property where all 4 units are rented out, cool. What are those numbers? Because you don't want to get 5 years ahead and then rent out all 4 units and then realize you're not going to be profitable still. Like, what is the profit plan? This all circles back to what is the profit plan, and do you want to live where you're going to? So as far as the numbers, just a couple more details as far as how those work. Um, Appreciation. So if you're in a negative cash flow situation and you're paying out every month, first of all, what is that number? Can you afford it? And how does that compare to how much you'd be paying in rent if you were to just rent your own place? And if it's negative, assuming you're banking on appreciation, whether that's the rent values going up or the value of the property going up, what's the plan? Because you want to make sure the expenses, which don't just include your negative cash flow, we're talking interest on the loan, expenses to keep the property up, improvements, everything, taxes, which if you're in LA are huge. All of those expenses, how much in appreciation is that property going to have to appreciate in order for you to be profitable? Again, where's your profit coming from? Make sure to run those numbers. And then the last note on the numbers is I recommend run the numbers on a house hacking situation like we've talked about. What's the monthly cash flow, whether it's positive, break even, or negative? What is your long-term plan? How long are you planning to stay there? Because that impacts, profitability and principal pay down. And what's your appreciation speculation or calculation or whatever, assuming it happens. Run all of those numbers and then compare it to buying a straight investment property. And again, this is going to depend on where you're located, because if you're in the Midwest, that's a very different story than Los Angeles. And just a reminder in all of this, house hacking can work, but make sure you run all of this beforehand. Don't assume it's just going to work. So Midwest versus Los Angeles, for example, if I'm in Los Angeles and I buy a house hacking property where I'm going to live in one unit and whatever, I've run all of those numbers. Let's say I'm going to have to spend $1 million to do it. And again, that is not in the nicer area of LA for a fourplex. So prepare. So I spent $1 million on this thing and I have some plan somehow to profit. Well, what if I were to buy an out of state single family house for $100,000, which is completely feasible? There's a chance that I could be more profitable, at least in cash flow, doing that. And my entry price has only been $100,000. So if I actually had the $1 million, so to speak, to leverage or to whatever, I could buy several single family houses and all of those produce significantly more cash flow than my house hacking situation. Or they produce significantly enough cash flow to cover my living expenses. This is what people forget. You may not necessarily have to live in the building that you buy, but if I have 10 cash flowing rental properties, all of that income may essentially cover my living expense wherever I am. I don't have to be in those properties. I'm not tied to that property, but those are funding me. And if we are talking like Midwest versus Los Angeles, there is a appreciation difference. Like LA is much more likely to appreciate than Kansas City, Indianapolis, Midwest, wherever. So one could argue that in the long run, that fourplex that you're house hacking in LA could end up being more profitable than 10 cash flowing single family houses in the Midwest. But again, you're speculating. So, house hacking versus a straight investment property, run those numbers also. So, this was a rambly video. I get it. And you may have to listen to it a couple times because I really kind of barreled through quite a few different things there. But a quick summary: if you're going to house hack, before you sign on the dotted line, make sure you know where your profit's going to come from. What is the price of that property versus the income it's going to get? And how does that relate to your personal expenses, both your wallet, if you're having to cover anything every month, and how much you would be spending to just rent or buy your own place? And then location. Do you want to live in the place where, first of all, do you want to live in a fourplex or duplex or triplex, fiveplex, sixplex, 117plex, whatever? Do you want to live there? Is it in an area, is somewhere where the numbers work, an area you want to live in for X number of years? Maybe, maybe not. And then, back into the numbers, make sure you really understand the expenses related to this and compare that to the appreciation that you're potentially banking on, and run the numbers on a house hack versus a straight investment property. You might be surprised in a lot of cases that the straight investment property is actually going to be more profitable and still essentially cover your living expenses. So house hacking has become trendy for a good reason, because it can be amazing strategy, but don't let the trendiness and the popularity trick you into thinking that every house hacking situation is a great one. One last note, if you're handy and your goal is to buy like a distressed fourplex and fix it up while you're living there, now that's a different story. That could be amazing. Again, run the numbers, run the rehab numbers, run the ARV, the after repair value, run all of those numbers again. But that is a sneakier way into really making house hacking pretty profitable. So make sure you know where your profit's coming from and that you've considered all of the aspects related to house hacking. Whew, that was a long one.